not a stranger to war. I served in Afghanistan, which was itself a particularly brutal conflict, but it is like a bar fight compared to what can happen if the nuclear powers escalate the war, which is currently playing out in Ukraine. It feels like the most dangerous situation in my lifetime. A nuclear threat, a threat to everybody, is very apparent. It feels like we're teetering on the edge of that, and yet we have people who seem to be viewing it as a kind of football match, who are painting their faces and cheerleading, where all kinds of particularly war-horny takes have been emerging about no-fly zones, about different forms of intervention.
It would be a cinch, Dawn, to take them out. You send in the RAF, it would take them an hour and a half.
Particular sets of journalists are always fairly war-horny. They have an ambient level of war-horniness because they think war is glamorous and cool.
Absolutely bang, that's the day-to-day, bringing you another tear on the face of the world's mother. You're both at each other's throats, you're backing yourselves up with arms. What are you going to do about it? Mr. Hawtrey, let me give you a hint. Bang!
You'd like me to say it?
I want you to say it, yes.
You want the word?
The word...
War.
War. Gentlemen, I'll put you on hold.
That's it, Chris. It's war. War has broken out. This is a war.
That's it. Yes, it's war.
War is appealing for some journalists, particularly the journalists who haven't experienced it, because with war can go a particular boost to your career, a higher level of attention, more Twitter followers, more likes on Twitter, and I think that is a bad metric by which to measure the need for war. I can remember people talking about Donald Trump, how he could start a nuclear war on Twitter. Many of those same people of the blue tick species are using the platform to lobby for a no-fly zone that could lead to nuclear war. The kind of people who would formulate themselves as the grown-ups in the room are treating the risk of nuclear war as if it is just a kind of tit for tat in Westminster or in Washington DC. This is not just Labour source says, this is not just handbags in the House of Commons. This is not that. This is bigger. Nuclear war doesn't mean anything good for the world. You could survive potentially, but you wouldn't want to. We actually had some training about this when I was in the army. We have to get togged up in our NBC, nuclear biological chemical warfare suits with respirators, and we'd be made to run up and down, and occasionally we'd be CS gassed, and we'd be told how to survive a nuclear apocalypse. The slogan was used in the videos, which were all from the 80s, was survive to fight. So you survive the nuclear apocalypse, the positive blast wave comes, and you all lay down, assuming you see it coming, and then you stay down for a bit because then the negative blast wave comes back and that passes over you, and then you are alive to fight. And all I could think about during these training processes was fight over what? Fight over the mutant wastelands? Become fucking Mad Max and cut around in your Nissan Micra or a Ford Escort with a gun on top? What is there left? That's the notion of mutually assured destruction, that everybody is destroyed. I mean, that's the underpinning thing, everybody dies. The problem with Twitter and Twitter war hysteria and all the social media stuff, it guides you towards just rapid, urgent reaction. It's very often a kind of appeal to emotion, that something must be done instantly, and clearly things need to be done because people are dying in Ukraine, but I do think we need to be cautious. We need to be exercising reason rather than emotion. I understand why there are a set of people who are kind of like, let's bomb the 40-mile convoy. I understand why that is an appealing idea, that we can just go and stop that happening, but we need to steer away from the immediate emotional payoff and be reasoned. Doing that is an act of war on top of the war that's already going, and it would potentially escalate this. It would bring into conflict one nuclear power with another nuclear power. And there is a bigger picture, the biggest picture of all, which we have to consider here. World War I kicked off when one guy was murdered, and that led to 20 million deaths because it triggered a series of events which led to gigantic slaughter. When you look at wars historically, there are domino effects, and there are so many moving parts in the conflict in Ukraine, and each part has its own range of moving parts. So we have to be extremely careful when we're talking about how we intervene and what can be done. In our search for clarification and clarity, it may be the case there's more to be learned from the Cold War warriors than there is from the kind of keyboard warriors. It's definitely worth revisiting what people said who were involved in the periods of extreme tension between the old Soviet bloc and the West.
To preserve our civilization in this modern age, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
I'm absolutely down with the Ukrainian right to resist invasion. It's a war of aggression. Russia have invaded. It's not their country, and they should get out. And I respect the Ukrainian right to resist. I think we have to. I think that's the moral position. The Russians should go and leave the Ukrainians to decide their own future. Of course, it's more complex than just that. There are lots of different moving parts. NATO has expanded east. That, for Putin, is used by him to say, NATO's kind of pushing into our sphere of influence, and he talks about buffer zones. At the same time, that does not justify what Putin does, and it doesn't justify the Putin regime. We've heard a lot of stuff about that Azov battalion and the National Guard neo-Nazi elements to some degree were integrated into the Ukrainian armed forces. But the idea espoused by some on the left that because there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, somehow everyone in Ukraine is a neo-Nazi is just wrong. There are also other forces in Ukraine. There are various anarchist and progressive left libertarian militias who resist Russian occupation and fascist forces in Ukraine. And I think if we're interested in people's safety and security, I think we have to look past this seductive thing to kind of look to NATO or look to Russia and try and find on the NATO side a kind of liberal democratic values, or on the Russian side anti-imperialist or anti-fascist thing. I think we have to look for another narrative which doesn't internalise NATO good or Russia good. I have to have a much more sophisticated analysis of what's going on here. I have no illusions, as some centrist commentators do, that NATO is kind of wooferendum or FBPE with guns and missiles. That is not what it is. NATO's interest is stability in the sense that it's stability for Western capitalism. The bosses club of wealthy nations who are the original founder members, and then increasingly it's other countries who've sought NATO membership. If they're countries which are in the kind of what would have been the Soviet sphere of influence, I can understand their rationale for wanting to be involved in that because they've been occupied by the Soviets. But again, I find myself just increasingly calling for kind of nuance. I have the dubious honour of having a NATO medal. It's a little thing with a blue ribbon and it says in English and French, "In the service of peace and freedom." And that always jumped out at me because I left it with my little cousin with my granddad's medal, which is a Great War medal, which says "the war to end all wars." And in both cases, that's not very accurate. My experience of NATO is in Afghanistan. I was involved in the early stages of the NATO mission in Afghanistan. I understand and recognise NATO's part in bringing about huge amounts of violence in Afghanistan against Afghan people. I have comrades, particularly who served in the Royal Air Force, who were in Italy attaching bombs to the fighters which would fly over and bomb Libya and destroy Libya. We can see the results in both those countries of NATO's mission. I suppose I find myself in a weird position where I'm not a fan of NATO and of Putin's regime. I don't see the need to pick between these two poles. While everyone's posturing and virtue signalling and doing their hot takes on Twitter, the people who are dying here are working class Russian conscripts and members of the Ukrainian military and Ukrainian civilians. That's the tragedy in all this. There's an element almost of smugness, like Brits and Americans. Of all the people on the planet, Brits and Americans are kind of smugly looking on, going, oh, he's going to get bogged down. He's going to get bogged down in the country, get caught up in insurgency with people who don't want him. And it's like, why are you laughing about this? You've literally just done this. The Kabul airlift was last year to 20 years when you got booted out. And historically, this has happened all over the world. So I'm not sure why you're being so smug about it. Condoleezza Rice was asked, if you invade a sovereign country, it's a war crime.
When you invade a sovereign nation, that is a war crime. I mean, I think we're at just a real basic point there.
Well, I'd agree. It is certainly against every principle of international law and international order.
You've done all those things yourself and never been held accountable, and yet you can just go on TV and say that. Like the level of just sheer neck to do that. I guess part of it is how these people have been reconditioned. We kind of saw it with George Bush, where now he's a harmless old man who just paints a bit rather than a war criminal. We see it with Alistair Campbell out there tweeting away about how terrible Vladimir Putin is, and he helped make the case for Iraq. And it astonishes me that these people are still allowed on television and are not pariahs. They can just kind of nod along like they didn't do the same thing themselves, easily within living memory. But this is happening in a civilized part of the world.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
How could this happen here?
This is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
But there's no reflection on why in those places which are uncivilized, why there is conflict there or war there, why there is authoritarianism and dictatorship there. And in many cases, it's because they were colonized, government were imposed, because they've been brutally oppressed, because different sides have been played off against each other, funded by foreign powers. I find myself in a strange position of liking something before it was cool, being anti-war. And now all of a sudden, loads of people who've never uttered a word about Yemen or Palestine or Afghanistan are invoking like Tony Benn type speeches.
Responsibility we have too for our fellow citizens and for the human race wherever the war takes place. And now we're on the eve of nuclear warfare, and that would be the end of the human race.
It could be a kind of entry point for people to question wars more generally, because the things which are happening in Ukraine now were done in Iraq. In some cases, worse things over a much longer period. I mean, we're 6-7 days into this illegal invasion by a foreign power, and that is what happened in Iraq. We had the weird spectacle of some very mainstream media channels almost celebrating, how do you make a Molotov cocktail in 5 easy steps?
Really glad you're able to join us because we want to show you something that's pretty extraordinary, actually. They've sort of grated the styrofoam and they're now putting it into the bottles. The styrofoam works to make the Molotov cocktail sticky, to help it stick to vehicles, to other targets as well. You can see them grating it. It's really quite extraordinary.
I have friends who are from Derry in Northern Ireland, and they're doing that kind of, that kind of monkey meme where it's awkward. Like people who lived through British occupation, who would be out throwing Molotov cocktails and rocks at occupying troops, who are like, oh, this is cool now. And I think you could take that lesson, extrapolate it, and you could look at Palestine, you could look at people resisting occupation in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a lot of those people are like, what? Why was it not okay where we did it? And I think that it's a fair point to make. Like, why is it that now it's celebrated in what are news pieces? Why it's suddenly tolerable, even good and moral to do that?
Hello, yeah, we've come to join the Ukrainian army or whatever they're called. What are they called, Tom?
We've seen a steady procession of characters turning up at the Ukrainian embassy, gym bros with no military training, going, I want to go and fight in Ukraine, fight Putin for the Insta. For the Instagram likes. But I don't know, maybe like I understand there are other examples in the past of people going to Spain to fight Franco. I understand the motivation. I would suggest if you have no military training, it's probably a bad idea. I would stay at home and do like your back and buys or whatever. And there's a broader point I think there to be made about, I really agree with the solidarity that people are showing Ukraine. So I approve of them kicking Russian teams out of Champions League. I'm kind of down with a lot of the sanctions and stuff, but I can't help but question where that was for Iraq, where that is for Yemen, where that is for Palestine. There's something we really need to stop and look at there about why these degrees of solidarity and sanction are being applied to Russia. They never tried to do that with Tony Blair and George Bush in the Iraq War, and I think we have to have a little bit of self-reflection about why that is. We've seen it just in the last 7 days, the lack of nuance and the presence of misinformation, one-sided media, and it's more important than ever to support independent media and alternative voices which can highlight the nuances of big political events that are going on around the world. So support Double Down News on Patreon.